Imagine the last thing you ate was a strip of boiled leather. Not because you were starving in some distant wilderness, not because civilization had collapsed around you, but because you were a soldier of the Red Army, stationed inside the crumbling skeleton of a city that had become the most violent square mile on the face of the earth, and the leather belt around your waist was the only thing left that could be called food. This is Stalingrad, winter of 1942. And what happened to the human body here, what it was forced to consume just to keep the heart beating one more hour, is a story so dark, so viscerally horrifying, that most history books quietly skip past it. We don't. Welcome to Hunger and Horror, when the temperature becomes a weapon. Before we talk about what they ate, you need to feel where they were eating it. Minus 40 degrees Celsius. That number doesn't register properly in the human mind. It sounds like an abstraction, a figure on a weather chart. But let me make it real for you. At minus 40, exposed skin begins to die in minutes. Metal rifle barrels become so cold they fuse to bare hands. Breath crystallizes midair and falls like fine dust. The moisture in your eyes begins to freeze at the edges if you don't blink. Now imagine being hungry in that. 2 million men, Soviet and German alike, were locked inside a frozen labyrinth of collapsed factories, shattered apartment blocks, and flooded cellars. Entire city blocks had been reduced to abstract sculptures of twisted iron and pulverized brick. Stalingrad no longer looked like a city. It looked like the surface of some bombed-out, God-forsaken moon. And in the belly of this frozen ruin, the Soviet soldier waited, fought, and slowly, methodically, starved. The mathematics of slow starvation. Here is the official number that Soviet command issued as the daily food ration for a frontline soldier at Stalingrad during the worst periods of encirclement and supply collapse. 600 calories. A resting adult human requires roughly 1,500 calories simply to survive without moving. A soldier in combat, running, digging, carrying, trembling against the cold, burns somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day. They were given 600. That gap, that enormous, murderous gap between what the body needs and what it received, is where the horror begins. The official ration, when it arrived at all, looked like this: a thin ladle of kasha, buckwheat or millet porridge, boiled into gray, tasteless paste, and a small portion of bread. But the bread itself had long since stopped being bread in any meaningful sense. Bakers behind the lines had begun stretching flour with sawdust, with clay, with ground bark. The resulting loaves were dense, bitter, and barely digestible, more building material than food. But they added volume, and volume meant the illusion of a full stomach, even when no real nutrition passed the lips. One helmet. That was often the serving vessel. A single Red Army helmet passed between 4 or 5 men, filled with lukewarm gray slop. No salt. Sometimes no heat, just enough to keep the hands from shaking too badly to pull a trigger. The menu of desperation. When the official rations stopped coming, and they stopped coming often, as supply lines were bombed, frozen, or simply overwhelmed, the soldiers improvised. And what they improvised would make your stomach turn. Dead horses became precious. When a horse was killed by artillery fire, soldiers descended on the carcass within minutes, scraping flesh from frozen bone with bayonets and knives. Horse meat, boiled in helmet water over tiny fires made from shattered furniture, became a luxury. Men traded ammunition for a share of it. Officers looked the other way. Even the hooves were cracked open and boiled for the thin collagen broth they produced. Tasteless, oily, barely warm. But calories and calories meant another hour of life. Rats were hunted deliberately and skillfully. Soldiers learned their patterns through the rubble, set crude traps from wire and tin, and considered a caught rat a genuine windfall. Roasted over embers, a rat provided perhaps a few hundred calories. Not enough, never enough. But psychologically, the act of hunting something and winning provided a brief, savage sense of agency in a situation where agency had been utterly stripped away. Leather was consumed in multiple forms: belts, boot soles, ammunition pouches, saddle straps. All of it was scraped, soaked in water to soften, then boiled for hours until the water turned a murky brown. Men called it soup. It contained almost no nutritional value whatsoever, offering only the faintest trace of animal-derived collagen. But it was warm. It filled the mouth with something. And when the alternative was nothing, warm brown water that had touched leather was a meal. Some men ate the glue from propaganda posters, those enormous printed sheets plastered across remaining walls, showing heroic Soviet workers and triumphant soldiers. The paste behind the paper was animal-derived, containing traces of bone glue. Soldiers peeled it away and chewed it raw. What hunger does to a man. There is a specific kind of madness that prolonged, extreme hunger produces, and the soldiers of Stalingrad knew it intimately. It begins with obsession. Every waking thought bends toward food, not toward victory, not toward home, not toward survival in any abstract sense, toward specific foods. Men reported dreaming, with hallucinatory vividness, of their mothers' kitchens, of black bread with sunflower oil, of boiled potatoes with dill. They would wake in frozen cellars, certain for one merciful second that they could smell soup, and then the reality of frozen rubble and gun smoke would crash back in. Then comes the physical dissolution. Muscle disappears first, the body consuming itself from the inside. Then the face changes, the eyes sink, the cheekbones protrude, the skin takes on a grayish, almost translucent quality. Veterans describe their comrades as becoming ghosts while still breathing, men who moved through the ruins like shadows of themselves, performing the mechanical actions of combat on pure instinct, because conscious thought had narrowed to a single point: find something to eat. And then, and this is the part that is hardest to write, hardest to read, but impossible to omit, there were those who crossed the final line. The evidence is fragmentary, disputed in some quarters, documented in others. But historians who have studied the diaries, the NKVD reports, and the survivor testimonies have concluded that in the most extreme isolated pockets of the battle, in cellars cut off from all supply for weeks at a time, some soldiers consumed the flesh of the dead, not openly, not as policy, but as a final silent act of survival performed in darkness, never spoken of afterward. Hunger does not make monsters, but it reveals, with terrible clarity, exactly how thin the line between civilization and its absence truly is. The iron logic of the belly. Here is what the commanders understood, and what every soldier shaking hands confirmed. A hungry army does not fight, it endures, it suffers. It fires its rifle from muscle memory. But the savage, coordinated, aggressive warfare that wins battles, the kind that pushes forward, that takes ground, that breaks the enemy's will, requires fuel. The Soviet command knew this. Supply operations to Stalingrad were conducted under conditions of almost suicidal danger. Trucks crossing frozen terrain under artillery bombardment, aircraft running gauntlet after gauntlet of German fighters to drop supplies into shrinking pockets of resistance. Men died delivering food to men who were dying for want of it. And yet the city held. Somehow, on 600 calories and boiled leather and rat meat and sawdust bread, the soldiers of the Red Army held Stalingrad, and eventually, in February of 1943, surrounded and destroyed the German Sixth Army in one of the most consequential military victories of the 20th century. The history books call it a turning point. The soldiers who lived it called it something else entirely. They called it hell, and they meant it in the most literal, visceral, hungry sense of the word. Next episode, the British stew rotting in World War I trenches that men called the horror. Tinned meat, weeks old, served in mud and gas. You will never look at canned food the same way again. Subscribe. More nightmares await.